He didn't knock. He didn't warn her. He just walked up to her porch at 7 in the morning, yanked the surveying equipment right out of her hands, and dropped it in the mud. "You need to pack your things," Caleb Hirsch said, his voice carrying that particular kind of flat certainty that men use when they've already decided the conversation is over. "And you need to be gone before Sunday." Maren Ellis didn't flinch. She'd been a widow for 2 years. She'd survived worse mornings than this one. "That equipment belongs to the county," she said quietly. Caleb smiled, the kind of smile that made her skin crawl. "And this land belongs to this community. And this community doesn't want a wandering woman stirring up trouble near decent people's children." Decent people's children. She almost laughed, because the only children she'd been anywhere near, the only ones she'd shared a single meal with, were 2 small, half-starved kids on a struggling ranch across the fence. A boy named Eli who couldn't sleep without the light on, and a little girl named Josie who hadn't spoken above a whisper since the day her father died. Those were the children Caleb Hurst was trying to protect her from. If you're new here, welcome. This channel is where stories like this one live. Stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when life gives them no other choice. If this is your kind of story, hit that subscribe button right now, because we post new ones every week, and you do not want to miss what comes next. Hit the like button if you're already feeling something, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. It started, the way most things in Harlow Creek started, with a death nobody was ready for. Daniel Hart had been 38 years old when his truck slid off the mountain road on a February night, ice on the bridge, headlights catching nothing but dark water. He left behind a wife who hadn't loved him the right way for years, and 2 children who had loved him completely, Eli, 7 years old, and Josie, 5. The wife was gone within 4 months. Not dead, just gone. She packed a bag while the kids were at school and didn't leave a note. That left Gideon. Gideon Hart was Daniel's older brother by 4 years, and he was not, by any reasonable definition, prepared to raise children. He was a rancher. He worked alone. He woke at 4:30 in the morning, went to bed at 9, and in the hours between he did the kind of work that left no room for anything soft or delicate or small. He didn't know how to braid hair. He didn't know what size shoes a 5-year-old wore. He burned oatmeal twice before he figured out the trick of it, and even then it came out wrong. But he showed up. That much, he did. He showed up every single morning, even when he was so tired he could barely see straight. Even when Josie woke screaming at 2 a.m. and he sat on the edge of her bed for an hour with his big calloused hand on her back, not knowing what to say, saying nothing, just staying. He showed up because Daniel couldn't. The ranch sat in a low valley about 7 miles outside the town of Harlow Creek, Montana, and in the 2 years since Daniel's death, it had begun showing the strain of one person trying to hold it together. The fence posts on the eastern pasture leaned at angles that made Gideon's chest tighten every time he looked at them. The barn roof had developed a slow, patient leak that got worse every winter. The vegetable patch that Daniel's wife had kept, and that the kids kept asking about, had gone to weeds and then to nothing. Gideon managed. He didn't thrive. There's a difference, and he knew it better than anyone. He was 42 years old, and some mornings he felt every year of it in his knees. 1. Maren Ellis arrived in Harlow Creek on a Thursday in late September, driving a county truck with a cracked passenger window that whistled in the cold and a back seat full of surveying equipment she'd been lugging from town to town for 3 years. She was 32. She was a widow. Her husband, Thomas, had died of a fast-moving cancer 18 months after their wedding, and in the quiet aftermath of that, Maren had done what she always did when she didn't know how to stay somewhere. She moved. She took the surveying job because it kept her moving. Different counties, different assignments, different faces every few months. She'd gotten good at packing light. She'd also gotten good at not getting attached. The county had assigned her to survey a disputed boundary line between 3 private properties on the west side of Harlow Creek, and they'd set her up in a small rental cabin on the eastern edge of a property that backed up against the Hart Ranch. The fence between her cabin and the ranch ran about 40 yards from her front porch. She noticed the fence on the first morning. Then she noticed the 2 children standing on the other side of it, watching her unload her truck. The boy had dark hair and a serious expression. The girl was smaller, wearing a coat that was at least one size too big, and holding onto the fence with both hands like it might fly away. Marin raised a hand in a small wave. Neither of them waved back. She went inside. Bob. It took 4 days before anything changed. On the fourth morning, she stepped off her porch to start her equipment checks and nearly walked into Josie Hart, who was standing in the yard on Marin's side of the fence, which meant she'd gone through the gap, which meant she'd been watching for a while to find the gap, holding a dead bird. Not in a scary way, in the way that children hold things they don't know what to do with. "It fell out of the tree," Josie said. Her voice was so quiet Marin had to lean down to hear it. "I didn't want Uncle Gideon to find it because he'll bury it, and I don't want it buried." Marin looked at the bird. She looked at Josie. She crouched down to eye level. "What do you want to do with it?" she asked. Josie thought about it very seriously. "I want to make it a bed." "Okay," Marin said. "Let's make it a bed." She didn't have much, but she had a small wooden box in her cabin that had held surveying tools, and she had some dried grass from a walk she'd taken the day before. She'd picked it up because she didn't know why, she just had. And the two of them sat on the porch steps for 20 minutes, arranging grass in the bottom of the box until Josie was satisfied. Then Josie put the bird in and stood there looking at it. "Uncle Gideon's going to wonder where I am," she finally said. "Probably," Marin agreed. Josie looked at her. "Do you live here now?" "For a little while," Marin said. "Just for work." Josie nodded. She picked up the box very carefully with both hands and went back through the fence gap. Marin watched her go and stood there on the porch for a moment longer than she'd intended to. She met Gideon that evening. He came to the fence just before dusk, hat in hand, jaw working like he was chewing on something he hadn't quite decided how to say. He was tall, taller than she'd expected from seeing him at a distance, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of being outside in weather that didn't care about you. "Josie told me she bothered you this morning," he said. "She didn't bother me. She has a habit of—" He stopped, started again. "She goes places she's not supposed to." "She was taking care of something," Marin said. "I helped her. It wasn't a problem." He looked at her then, really looked, like he was trying to figure out whether she meant it or was just being polite. "Gideon Hart," he said, and put out his hand. "Marin Ellis." She shook it. His hand was twice the size of hers and rough as tree bark. "You're the surveyor." "I am." He nodded. Then, like it cost him something. "Thank you for being decent to her." And then he put his hat back on and walked back toward the ranch and didn't look over his shoulder. Marin stood there for a moment. Being decent to her. Like it was something that required gratitude. Like it was something that didn't happen as a matter of course. She thought about that for a long time after she went inside. The cold came early that year. By the first week of October, the mornings had teeth, and Marin had started waking up before her alarm to get the stove going before the temperature in the cabin dropped any further. She was making coffee one morning when she heard it, a sound from outside she couldn't immediately identify, and looked out the window to see Eli Hart standing in her yard in the dark, wearing a coat but no gloves, trying to work the latch on the gate that connected her property to the fence line. She opened the door. He startled so hard he nearly fell backward. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was higher than she expected, the kind of voice a kid has right before it starts to change. "I wasn't trying to— Josie wants to come see you, but she lost her mittens, and Uncle Gideon doesn't know she lost them, and—" "Eli," Marin said, "come inside, it's cold." He came in slowly, looking at everything in her cabin the way people look at places that feel different from their own lives. She poured him half a cup of coffee, mostly milk, and he held it in both hands like it was a gift. "Where are the mittens?" she asked. "Josie doesn't know. She thinks maybe the dog took them." Marin looked around her cabin. She had a pair of wool gloves she'd bought for the winter, women's medium, which would be big on a 5-year-old but not impossibly big. She also had the basic knowledge of how to hand sew, taught to her by her grandmother when she was 8. "Tell Josie I'll fix her something," she said. Eli blinked at her. "You sew?" "A little." "Uncle Gideon can't sew at all," he said. It wasn't unkind, it's just the matter-of-fact way kids report facts about the adults in their lives. "He tried to fix my jeans once. They looked really bad. She laughed, actually laughed, and the sound surprised her a little. She hadn't laughed at something small in a while. Thomas had been the one who could always find the small things worth laughing at, and when he died, she'd stopped being able to find them herself. "I'll do better than your jeans," she promised. Eli drank his half cup of coffee and told her, without being asked, that the ranch had 12 cattle, 3 horses, a dog named Biscuit, who was old and smelled bad, and that his uncle woke up every morning at 4:30 because he thought the ranch would fall apart if he slept until 5. Marin listened to all of it. When he left, going back through the fence gap, moving with the loose, easy lope of a boy who knew this property, now like his own, she sat in her kitchen for a minute thinking about a man who woke at 4:30 because he was afraid of what would happen if he slept. She knew something about that kind of fear. She'd spent 3 years outrunning it. By the 3rd week of October, she had become a morning fixture in the Hart kitchen. It hadn't happened on purpose. It hadn't happened because of any single decision. It had happened the way things happen when nobody is paying close enough attention, one small step at a time, each step making the next one seem more natural, until one day you were braiding a 5-year-old's hair at the kitchen table while a man you'd met 3 weeks ago poured you coffee without asking how you took it because he already knew. Gideon knew she took it black. She knew he took his with 1 spoon of sugar he always seemed vaguely embarrassed about. She knew Josie ate only the edges of her toast and saved the middle for the dog. She knew Eli had nightmares about his father's accident and dealt with them by reading, so she'd started leaving books on the fence post, things she thought a serious 7-year-old boy might like. He read everyone. She knew these things the way you come to know people when you spend enough mornings with them. Not because they told you, but because you paid attention. Because you were there, because being there, over time, adds up to something. Gideon noticed, though he didn't say much about it. He was not a man who said much about anything, but she caught him watching her sometimes, when she was helping Josie with her letters, or when she was explaining something to Eli about the land they were surveying. And there was something in the way he watched that wasn't quite the same as the way he looked at anything else on that ranch. She noticed that too. She didn't know what to do with it, so she did what she always did. She kept moving. She did the next thing, and the next, and she didn't let herself think too far ahead. Because thinking too far ahead meant thinking about what happened when the survey was done. And that she couldn't think about yet. Plus, it was Caleb Hurst who made her think about it. She'd seen him around town, the kind of man every small community seems to produce, the one who appoints himself the keeper of local order, who knows everyone's business because he makes it his business, who wraps his control in the language of concern. He was 60, maybe 65, with white hair and a handshake like a trap snapping shut. He'd been friendly enough when she first arrived, asked about her work, her timeline, where she was from, the usual. Then Josie had mentioned her by name at the general store, apparently something small, something innocent, just "Miss Marin fixed my mittens." And whatever that innocent mention set off in Caleb Hurst's mind, the friendliness had cooled. She'd caught him watching her truck when it was parked at the ranch, watching her and Gideon when they talked at the fence, not with any one particular expression she could name, just watching, the way a man watches something he's already decided he doesn't like. She didn't think much of it at first. She'd dealt with men like Caleb Hurst before, men who thought a woman moving through their world without permission was a kind of trespass that needed correcting. But then he came to her porch. On a Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of November, 7 a.m., and he didn't knock. He walked up and yanked the equipment right out of her hands. "You need to pack your things." Marin looked at her equipment in the mud. She looked at him. Her hands were very still. "That equipment belongs to the county," she said. "And this community doesn't want a wandering woman stirring up trouble near decent people's children." She picked up the equipment herself, unhurried, and brushed the mud off carefully. Her heart was going too fast, and she made herself breathe through it, the slow, deliberate breath she'd learned in the months after Thomas died, when panic could find her anywhere. "I have a contracted assignment from the county," she said. "It runs through the 1st of April. You're welcome to speak to the county office about your concerns." Caleb took a step closer. He was trying to use his size, she knew. He'd been doing it his whole life, probably, using size and certainty the way some people use words. The Hart children don't need a strange woman making herself at home in their lives, he said. They need stability, family, not someone who's going to pack up and leave the moment spring comes. She met his eyes. You'll be gone by spring, he said. It wasn't a question. Something moved through her. She wasn't sure what to call it. Not anger exactly. Something older. She thought about the apple tree. 3 weeks ago, she and the kids had planted it, a small, struggling sapling in the far corner of the ranch yard, in a spot Gideon had said got good sun. Josie had carried it like a baby. Eli had dug the hole, very seriously, with a focus that made Marin's throat ache, and Marin had held it steady while they filled in the dirt around the roots. She'd thought, when they planted it, that it might be a strange thing to do. To plant something that took years to grow in a place you didn't plan to be. She thought about it now. She looked at Caleb Hurst with his mud-dirty boots and his folded arms and his absolute certainty that he already knew exactly what she was. And she smiled. It surprised him. She could see it. The slight shift, the reassessment, the moment when his certainty cracked the tiniest fraction. Then why did I plant an apple tree? She said. Caleb opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Marin picked up the last of her equipment and went inside. She stood in her kitchen for a moment with her back against the door. Her hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the thing that comes after fear, when the fear has been held steady long enough that it doesn't get to win. Her coffee was still on the counter, still warm. She picked it up and drank it. Outside, she heard Caleb Hurst's boots on the steps, then on the dirt path, then gone. She looked out the window at the fence. On the other side of it, just visible through the morning light, she could see the top of the apple tree sapling. Bare now, just branches, but rooted. Still there. She thought about what Caleb had said, and she thought about what she'd answered, and for the first time in a very long time, she let herself think about what spring might look like if she didn't run from it. It was terrifying. It was also, and this she held quietly, like something fragile, something that felt a lot like hope. She didn't tell Gideon about Caleb. She thought about it. Considered it the way you consider whether to mention a strange sound in the walls, weighing whether saying it out loud would make it more real than it needed to be. But she looked at Gideon across the breakfast table that morning, watching him cut Josie's toast into triangles with the focused, careful attention of a man who'd had to learn everything about domesticity the hard way. And she decided against it. He had enough. She could see it in the way he moved, that particular quality of exhaustion that doesn't live in the body so much as behind the eyes, the kind that sleep doesn't fully fix because it's not really about sleep. He'd been out in the north pasture since before 4 that morning, repairing a section of fence that had buckled under the first hard frost. He'd come in for breakfast with mud on his jacket and a cut on his left hand he hadn't bothered to mention until Josie spotted it and made a sound that brought everything in the kitchen to a stop. Uncle Gideon, you're bleeding. It's nothing. It's not nothing. There's blood on your sleeve. Josie. Miss Marin. He's bleeding. Marin had already gotten up. She'd found the first aid kit. She'd reorganized it 3 weeks ago because it had been a disaster. Bandages mixed in with batteries and a bottle of aspirin that had expired in 2019. And she came back to the table and sat down across from him without asking permission and opened his hand. The cut was on the heel of his palm. Not deep enough to need stitching, but not nothing. Gideon watched her clean it with the focused, slightly uncomfortable expression of a man who wasn't used to being tended to. His hand was very still. She could feel the rough texture of it, the calluses built up over years of wire and wood and work that didn't stop because your hands needed a rest. Barbed wire, he said, by way of explanation. I figured. I should have worn the other gloves. Josie watched from across the table with the intense, solemn attention of a child who has decided this moment is very important. Eli ate his oatmeal and pretended not to watch, which meant he was watching everything. Marin wrapped his hand, taped it, and sat back. Thank you, Gideon said. Don't use that hand for anything today. He almost smiled. Almost. I'll get right on that. I'm serious. I've got 12 cattle in a water trough that's been freezing overnight and a barn door that won't close all the way. Use your other hand. He did almost smile again, and this time it got a little further, and for just a second she saw what his face looked like when it wasn't carrying all of the weight it usually carried, and then Josie knocked over her juice and the moment dissolved into the ordinary chaos of a breakfast table, and Marin went to get the cloth, and life resumed. But she kept the image of that almost smile. She kept it the way you keep small things that you're not sure what to mean yet. The cold settled in hard that November. It was the kind of cold that Harlow Creek locals talked about in tones that made newcomers feel they were being warned about something biblical. Not just the temperature, but the wind, the way it came down off the mountains without apology, and found every gap in every wall and every thin place in every coat. Marin had grown up in Wisconsin, which meant she knew cold, but Montana cold had a different personality. It was less patient. It didn't ease in. She bought Josie proper mittens at the general store. It's small, red, lined with fleece, and the girl wore them every day with such visible satisfaction that it made something in Marin's chest ache in a way she couldn't quite explain. She also bought a better hat for Eli, who'd been wearing one with a hole near the left ear that he hadn't complained about once. He looked at the hat when she gave it to him. He looked at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." He put it on. It fit. He pulled it down over his ears with both hands the way kids do when they want to show something fits without saying anything about it. "It's a good hat," he said finally. "Yeah," she said, "it is." That was as close as Eli Hart got to thank you, and she understood it perfectly. What she hadn't expected, what she hadn't prepared for, was how quickly the rhythm of the ranch would start to feel like something she recognized. She'd lived out of a truck and a rental cabin for 3 years. She'd eaten alone more meals than she could count. She'd learned to be self-sufficient in the particular way that single people learn it, not because it's what they wanted, but because it's what they have, and you either make peace with it or you don't sleep well. She'd mostly made peace with it. But there was something about the Hart kitchen in the mornings, the specific noise of it, the particular small disorder of it, Josie's running commentary on whatever she was thinking about, Eli's occasional dry observation, the sound of Gideon's boots on the floorboards and the scrape of his chair. That got under her defenses in a way she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't that it was perfect. It was specifically that it wasn't. The oatmeal was sometimes scorched. Josie occasionally cried at breakfast for reasons that remained completely unclear. Eli and Gideon had a recurring argument about whether the dog should be allowed in the kitchen that never got resolved, and the dog came in anyway. Gideon burned the toast twice a week with a consistency that suggested he hadn't fully accepted that the stove ran hot. It was messy and loud in stretches, and quiet in other stretches in ways that took some getting used to, and none of it was polished, and all of it was real. And Marin found herself, against her own best judgment, against the 3 years of careful practice she'd put into not getting attached to places or people, finding herself looking forward to it. That scared her more than Caleb Hurst had. She was in the barn with Gideon on a Wednesday afternoon, helping him move feed sacks, which she'd offered to do because she'd seen him favoring the cut hand, and he'd been moving more slowly than usual, when he asked her about Thomas. He didn't lead up to it. That wasn't his way. "Your husband," he said, shifting a sack with his good hand. "How long ago?" She'd been asked before. It always came with a particular quality of careful concern that felt like it required something from her. The right amount of grief, displayed the right way, so the other person could feel they'd handled it properly. Gideon wasn't doing that. He was moving feed sacks and asking because he wanted to know. 2.5 years, she said. He nodded. He was sick, she said. It was fast. Cancer. She paused. We'd been married 18 months. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's not enough time." "No," she said. "It's not." He set down the sack and looked at her straight. No performance in it, no attempt to say the right thing. "I'm sorry," he said. Simple. Like he meant only exactly that, nothing more. She'd heard "I'm sorry" hundreds of times. This was the first time in a long while that it had landed anywhere real. "Daniel," she said, "your brother. The kids told me a little." Ice on the bridge. His voice went flat when he said it. Not cold, but the way voices go when something has been said so many times that the saying of it has worn smooth. February. He was coming home late. Were you close? He thought about it. He was annoying as hell when we were kids, he said. Borrowed my truck and always brought it back with the gas low. Thought he was funnier than he was. A pause. Yeah, we were close. She almost smiled. He sounds like it. The kids have his laugh, Gideon said. Eli especially. Sometimes I hear it, and He stopped, started moving feed sacks again. She didn't push. She knew what it was to have a sentence that ran out before it was finished. They worked in silence for a while, and the silence was the kind that had some weight to it but wasn't uncomfortable, and that was its own kind of thing. Caleb Hurst's second visit came on a Thursday. This time he didn't come to her. He went to Gideon. She found out about it the way she found out about most things on the ranch. Not directly, but through the particular silence Gideon brought back with him when he came in from the eastern field mid-afternoon. A silence with an edge to it she hadn't seen before. He poured himself coffee, didn't drink it, set it down, and stood at the counter with his back to the kitchen for a moment longer than made sense. Josie was napping. Eli was at school. What happened? Marin asked. Nothing. Gideon. He turned around. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was working something through. A small, tight movement, like he was chewing on the inside of his cheek. Caleb Hurst came by, he said. She waited. He thinks I should be more careful about who I let around the kids. He said it flatly, without inflection, which she'd learned meant the opposite of what it sounded like. It meant he was more bothered than he wanted to show. He thinks it looks a certain way, you being here. What way? He picked up the coffee, drank some of it. Improper, he said, like the word itself was something he didn't want in his mouth. Marin was quiet. I told him to mind his own business, Gideon said. Okay. I told him you were helping, and that was all, and that the kids were none of his concern. Okay, he looked at her. I just thought you should know someone was saying it. He came to my porch too, she said. Last week. Gideon went very still. He dropped my equipment in the mud, she said. Told me I needed to be gone before Sunday. The stillness got harder. She'd seen Gideon angry before, brief, controlled flashes of it, usually directed at broken equipment or frozen pipes. But this was different. This was the quiet kind, the kind that lived under the surface. You didn't tell me, he said. You had enough going on. Marin, it's fine. I handled it. It's not fine. He said it without raising his voice, which made it worse somehow. He put his hands on your equipment. I picked it back up. That's not the point. He set the coffee down hard enough that it sloshed. You shouldn't have had to. She looked at him. He was genuinely angry, not at her, but at the situation, at Caleb, at the fact that he hadn't known, at the particular helplessness of finding out after the fact that someone had come to make a woman feel small in her own yard and he hadn't been there. I can take care of myself, she said, not unkindly. I know that. He ran a hand over his face. That's not what I'm saying. She waited. I don't want you to have to, he said. And then, like that had come out more than he'd intended, he turned and poured the rest of his coffee down the sink. The kitchen was very quiet. Marin sat there with all the things she could have said and chose to say none of them, because some moments need to breathe. Eli came home from school that afternoon with a bruised eye and a story that came out in pieces. The way stories come out from 7-year-olds who are trying to figure out how much trouble they're in. A boy at school, older, 12 or 13, had said something about Marin, about her being at the ranch. The specific words Eli used to describe what the boy had said were vague in a way that suggested they'd been worse than what he was reporting, and the bruise on his eye suggested that Eli had not chosen to respond with words. Gideon sat across from him at the kitchen table with his hands folded and his face doing something complicated. Who threw the first punch? He asked. Eli looked at his hands. He said something bad. Who threw the first punch? A very long pause. Me. Gideon nodded slowly. Okay. Eli looked up. Are you mad? I'm not thrilled, Gideon said. Fighting doesn't fix. He said Miss Marin was... Eli stopped. His jaw tightened in a way that was so much like his uncle's that Marin had to look away for a second. I know, Gideon said. It wasn't true. I know that too. Then why? Because sometimes people say things that aren't true, Gideon said, and you have to figure out how to not let it make you hit someone, even when you really want to. He paused. Which is hard. I know it's hard. Eli was quiet for a moment. Did you ever hit someone for saying something bad? Gideon looked at him. Once or twice, he said. When I was about your age, actually. Did it help? In the moment. He looked down at his folded hands. Less so later. Eli sat with that. Then, my eye hurts. I bet it does. Gideon got up and got him a cloth and some ice. You're not in trouble. But next time, you come and tell me first. What if you're not there? Then you tell Miss Marin. He said it without looking at either of them, busy with the ice and the cloth, casual as if he said things like that every day. Marin watched him cross back to Eli and press the cloth against the boy's eye, watched Eli wince and accept it, and she thought, he doesn't even know he said it like that. He didn't. That was the thing. The snow came in the second week of November, and it came the way the locals had warned her it would. Not gently, not by degrees, but all at once, dropping nearly a foot overnight and waking them to a world that had been rewritten. The ranch had particular vulnerabilities in snow, Marin had learned. The water troughs froze by morning. One of the cattle, an older one named Rue, that Josie was inexplicably attached to, had a habit of getting herself into low spots and needing to be helped out. The barn roof, with its slow leak, needed to be checked after every heavy fall. She'd learned all of this not because anyone had explained it to her, but because she'd been there for enough mornings to watch the patterns. And so that morning, without being asked, she got up at 4:15, pulled on every layer she had, and went to help. Gideon was already in the yard when she came out, head down against the wind, moving toward the barn. He stopped when he saw her. You don't have to, he started. I know where Rue gets stuck, she said, and walked past him toward the south pasture. She heard him behind her a second later, following. They worked for 2 hours in the dark and the cold and the snow that kept coming sideways and found every gap between her collar and her hat. She broke ice from 3 troughs. She helped move Rue, who was exactly where she'd expected, and who allowed herself to be guided with the dumb, placid acceptance of a cow who'd done this before. She helped Gideon nail a temporary patch over the worst section of the barn roof while standing on a ladder she didn't entirely trust, her hands going numb inside her gloves. They didn't talk much. There wasn't room for it, in the cold and the work and the wind. But when they came back to the house, just as gray light started to come up over the eastern ridge, and Marin's feet were wet and her face hurt, and she was tired in a way that was actually satisfying, the specific tired that comes from having done something real, Gideon stopped on the porch and looked at her. You're frozen through, he said. I'm fine. Your lips are blue. I'm fine, Gideon. He opened the door for her. Inside, the kitchen was warm, and it hit her like something physical. She stood in the doorway for a second, just letting it. Coffee, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. He made it, and she sat down at the table and pulled off her gloves and held her hands around the cup when he set it down, and the warmth worked its way back in slowly, finger by finger. He sat down across from her. He had snow in his hair and mud on his jacket, and he looked for once like a man who had been helped with something he'd been doing alone for too long. He didn't say anything about it, but she saw it. 2 days later, she found the wood shavings. She'd gone to the barn for something, a spare tarp she'd left there. And in the back corner, in the space behind the old tack rack where Gideon did small woodworking projects when the weather was too bad for outside work, there was a work table covered in fresh shavings. On the table, half finished, was something she couldn't immediately identify. She picked it up. It was small, fit in her palm, round but not quite, carved from what looked like apple wood, pale and smooth where the knife had worked it, rough still at the top where he hadn't finished. She turned it over. She understood it a second before she put it down. It was an apple. He was carving her an apple, handmade, wood, something she could hold. She set it down very carefully where she'd found it, her heart doing something she didn't have a name for, and walked back to the house. She did not say anything about it. She made dinner instead. A proper dinner, with the beef she'd bought in town and the potatoes from the cellar and the kind of bread that takes 2 hours because it needs to rise, which meant she'd been planning it since morning. She set the table the way she'd seen Gideon do it, plates on the left, mismatched forks, a glass of milk for each kid, even though Josie usually only drank half. When Gideon came in and saw the table, he stopped in the doorway the same way she'd stopped at the barn. "You didn't have to," he said. "I wanted to," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. The kids came in from the living room in a small rush of noise, and Josie immediately told Gideon that Marin had made real bread, not the kind from the can, and that it smelled better, and Eli said he already knew that. He'd smelled it from upstairs. Marin brought the food to the table, and Josie climbed into her chair, and Eli poured his own milk with the careful concentration of someone who's been told not to spill it, and Gideon helped Josie with her coat because she'd forgotten to take it off. They ate. It was loud and imperfect, and Josie spilled her milk anyway, and Eli ate too fast and got hiccups, and Gideon burned his mouth on the bread because he didn't wait for it to cool, which was entirely his own fault. And Marin sat at that table in that warm, imperfect kitchen and thought about Caleb Hurst and his certainty that she would be gone by spring, and thought about the apple tree in the yard, bare-branched and rooted, and thought about a half-finished wooden apple in a barn corner, and felt something settle in her chest. Not resolution, exactly. Not decision. Something quieter than that. Something that felt, underneath all the fear of it, like the beginning of one. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Caleb Hurst was not finished. While she was learning where the water troughs were, while she was braiding Josie's hair, while she was eating bread at a table that had started to feel like hers, Caleb was talking to someone. Someone who had more leverage than a man with muddy boots and a bad opinion. Her name was Ruth Hart. She was 71 years old. She was Daniel and Gideon's mother. And she had not been to the ranch in 6 months. Not since the summer. Not since the last time she and Gideon had argued about whether the children belonged on a working ranch or somewhere more settled, somewhere with a proper school and a proper household routine, and a grandmother who could provide what a single man with cattle could not. Ruth Hart had opinions. She'd had them her whole life, and time had not softened them any. Caleb Hurst knew Ruth Hart from the Methodist congregation. He'd known her for 30 years, and he knew, because he was the kind of man who cataloged these things, that Ruth had been worried about those grandchildren since the moment they came to live with Gideon. He went to see her on a Friday afternoon. He told her about Marin, about her being at the ranch every morning, about the surveying assignment that ran through April, and what the town was saying about it, and what the implications were for 2 small children who'd already had one woman walk out of their lives without warning. He did not tell lies exactly. He just arranged the truth in a particular order. Ruth Hart listened to all of it over a cup of tea in her kitchen in Billings, 200 miles away, and when Caleb was done, she set down her cup and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "I think it's time I paid my son a visit." Caleb drove home feeling like a man who'd done something useful. And 2 days later, on a Sunday afternoon when the sky was the particular white-gray of a Montana winter that can't make up its mind, a familiar truck came down the road toward the Hart Ranch and pulled into the yard, and Gideon Hart, who was standing at the fence watching his cattle, saw it coming and went very still. He stood there until the truck stopped and the door opened, and his mother stepped out into the cold. She was small. He'd always been surprised by how small she was, given how large her presence had always felt in his childhood. White-haired now, moving carefully on the frozen ground, wearing the heavy brown coat he'd given her 2 Christmases ago. She looked across the yard at him. He walked over. "Mom," he said. "Gideon," she said. She looked past him, at the house, at the barn, at the yard. Her eyes stopped at the apple tree sapling, small and bare, and staked against the wind. "Who planted that?" she asked. He looked at the tree. He looked at his mother. "We did," he said. Ruth Hart looked at the tree for another moment. Then she looked at her son with an expression that had something complicated working through it, love and worry, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who'd been making up her mind about things for 71 years. "I heard you've had help," she said. "I have," he said. "I want to meet her." He held his mother's gaze. "Okay," he said. "You can meet her." And in the house, unaware that anything had shifted, Marin was teaching Josie how to fold napkins into something approximating swans, and Eli was reading at the table, and the stove was warm, and the bread from Thursday was still on the counter, mostly gone. In the house, everything was ordinary. Outside in the cold, the thing that could change all of it had just walked into the yard. Ruth Hart did not hug her son when she walked into the yard. She patted his arm, twice, firmly, the way she'd always done it, like she was checking that he was still structurally sound. And then she looked at the house again and said, "Is she in there now?" "She's usually here in the mornings," Gideon said. He kept his voice even. "She comes for breakfast, helps with the kids before school." Ruth took that in without reacting. "And the rest of the day?" "She works. She's a surveyor, Mom. She has a job." "Caleb said she's here most evenings, too." "Caleb Hurst," Gideon said, "needs to find something better to do with his time." Ruth looked at him with the expression she'd been giving him since he was 12 years old and trying to be more reasonable than he felt. The look that said she could see through every inch of it. He's concerned about the children. He doesn't know the children. He knows this community. This community, Gideon said, is not raising Eli and Josie. I am. Ruth was quiet for a moment. The cold settled around them, and somewhere in the south pasture, one of the cattle made a low sound and went quiet again. She looked at the apple tree sapling one more time, really looked at it, taking in the stake, the tied branch, the careful placement of it in the patch of ground that got the best afternoon sun. "Take me inside," she said. "I'm cold." He did. Marin heard the door. She looked up from the kitchen table where Josie had abandoned the napkin swans in favor of drawing horses, and saw Gideon come through first, and then the small white-haired woman behind him, and she understood immediately who this was without needing to be told. There was something in the set of her jaw, the way she moved through a doorway like she was deciding whether to approve of it. Marin stood up. "Mom," Gideon said, "this is Marin Ellis. Marin, this is my mother, Ruth." Ruth Hart looked at her for a moment with the particular focus of someone taking an inventory. Marin had the feeling of being measured against a standard she hadn't been told about. "Mrs. Hart," Marin said. "Ruth," the woman said. She looked at Josie. Her expression changed, not softened exactly, but shifted into something less guarded. "Come here, Josie bird." Josie scrambled off her chair and crossed the kitchen and allowed herself to be hugged with the tolerant affection of a child who finds grandmother hugs somewhat unnecessary but accepts them. "Grandma Ruth, I made napkin swans," she said into Ruth's coat. "Did you?" "Miss Marin taught me. They don't really look like swans, though." Ruth looked up at Marin over Josie's head. "No?" "They look a little more like napkins," Marin admitted. Something moved across Ruth's face, too quick to name, gone before it settled. She released Josie and took off her coat, which Gideon took from her, and sat down at the kitchen table like she'd been sitting at it for years, because she had. "I'll make tea," Marin said. She didn't ask Ruth if she wanted any. She just made it, because it was cold, and the woman had driven 200 miles, and it was the right thing to do. She heard Gideon behind her talking to his mother in the low, careful tone of a man navigating ground he can see as uneven, and she kept her back to them and focused on the kettle. Eli came downstairs and stopped on the last step when he saw Ruth. "Grandma," he said, with the particular flatness of a boy who doesn't know if he's glad or cautious. "Eli, you've grown." People keep saying that because it keeps being true. He came into the kitchen and sat down and looked at the table like it might tell him something. Ruth watched him with eyes that had more in them than she was showing, and Marin, carrying the tea to the table, caught a glimpse of it. The grief in Ruth's heart, old and deep, the grief of a woman who had buried a son and was terrified of losing two more things she loved. She understood that grief. She'd worn it herself for long enough. And Gideon took his mother's bag to the guest room, and while he was gone, Ruth sat at the table with the children, and Maren stayed in the kitchen, not quite part of the table, and not quite apart from it, refilling cups and not making herself small, but not making herself large either. Ruth asked Josie about school, about her friends, about what she was learning. Josie told her at length about a disagreement she'd had with a girl named Clara over who got to be the line leader, and her position on this was detailed and not entirely impartial, and Ruth listened to all of it with the focused patience of a grandmother who has been listening to children make their cases for a very long time. Then Ruth asked Eli what he was reading. Eli told her. It was a book about a boy who builds a boat. He summarized the plot with the selective efficiency of someone who doesn't want to give away the parts he likes most. Miss Maren gave it to him, Josie said helpfully. She gives him books. She leaves them on the fence. Ruth looked at Maren. On the fence? He mentioned he liked reading, Maren said. She kept her voice easy. I had some books in the cabin. It wasn't a big thing. It was 17 books, Eli said. He didn't look up from the table, but there was something in the way he said it. Ruth looked at Eli. She looked at Maren. She looked at her tea. She didn't say anything else about it. Gideon came back and dinner happened the way dinner happened in that house. Imperfectly, noisily, with Josie talking over everyone at least twice, and Eli eating too fast again, and Gideon burning the bottom of the rice because he was listening to his mother and forgot to stir it, and Maren fixing the rice as much as it could be fixed, and saying nothing about it. Ruth ate and observed. She asked Gideon about the cattle, about the roof, about the water situation in the north pasture. She asked with the specific knowledge of someone who had grown up on land and understood what the questions meant. Not small talk, but real accounting of whether things were being held together. Gideon answered each question honestly, which was the only way he knew how to answer anything. The fence on the east side needs more work in spring, he said. The barn roof I'm watching. The cattle are in decent shape. Rue is old, but she's eating. Ruth nodded at each of these things. Then, and the children schooling? They go every day, he said. I meant beyond that. Their schoolwork. Whether they're keeping up. Eli's reading above his grade, Maren said. Ruth looked at her. It wasn't hostile, but it was assessing. His teacher sent a note home last month, Maren continued. She said he's one of the strongest readers in the class. He has trouble with arithmetic, but he works at it. And Josie? Josie's letters are coming along. She reverses her B's and D's, which is common at her age. We've been working on it. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, we. The word sat on the table. Gideon looked at Maren. Maren looked at her plate for a second, then back at Ruth, because she was not going to apologize for the word. I've been helping, she said, when they need it. Ruth turned back to her tea. I see, she said. The dinner finished. Maren washed the dishes because it was her habit now, and because she needed something to do with her hands, and Ruth helped dry them, which she hadn't expected, and they stood at the sink together for several minutes in the kind of silence that is its own form of communication. Ruth said, finally, You lost your husband. Yes. Gideon told me, before I came. A pause. I'm sorry. Thank you. How long were you married? 18 months? Ruth set down a plate, picked up another one. Daniel was married for 6 years before... She stopped, started again. 6 years isn't enough time either. No, Maren said. It's not. Ruth dried the plate in her hand, slow circles, not looking at anything. Josie doesn't remember very much about her mother, she said. She was 3 when Lee left. 3-year-olds don't hold on to things the same way. Maren didn't say anything. She waited. Eli remembers, Ruth said. He was 5. He remembers being picked up from school and there not being anyone home. Maren's hands stilled under the water. He told you? She asked. He told Gideon once. Gideon told me. Ruth set the plate in the rack. I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it because those children have already learned that people leave, Eli especially. She finally looked at Maren. He doesn't talk about it, but he's watching. He watches everyone who comes through that door for signs of when they're going to go. Marin turned off the water. She dried her hands on the dish towel and held it for a moment. I know, she said quietly. Ruth held her gaze. Do you? I see it every morning, Marin said. The way he waits to see if I'm still there. The way he acts like nothing matters, and it very obviously does. She folded the towel over the rack. I see it. Ruth was quiet for a long time. The kitchen had emptied. Gideon was in the living room with the kids, and their voices came through low and warm, Josie telling some story that required a lot of animated arm movement based on the pauses in it. When does your assignment end? Ruth asked. And there it was, the question that had been in the room since Ruth walked through the door. April 1st, Marin said. Ruth nodded once, like a period at the end of a sentence she'd already written in her mind. She took the dish towel Marin had folded and hung it more evenly on the rack, the way a woman does who has strong opinions about dish towels, and walked out of the kitchen without saying anything else. She stayed for 4 days. 4 days was enough time for Marin to understand Ruth Hart in a way she hadn't been able to from the outside. She was not a cruel woman. She was not even an unkind one, in the strictest sense. She was a woman who had built her defenses from love. The kind of love that, when it loses something, builds walls so that it can't lose any more things. She'd lost a son. She was terrified of what happened to those children if they attached themselves to someone who left. She'd decided Marin was going to leave. She'd decided it before she walked through the door, probably. Marin couldn't blame her for it. She could, however, see it clearly. On the second day, Ruth took Josie to town for new shoes, which Josie needed, and Marin stayed at the ranch to work. On the third day, Eli came home from school and went straight to find Marin rather than going inside, which he'd been doing for weeks now without comment. And Marin was at the far end of the surveying line with her equipment when she heard him coming through the field. Grandma Ruth asked me something, he said, without preamble. She looked up from the equipment. What? She asked me if I'd be sad when you left. Marin set down the receiver very carefully. What did you say? Eli scuffed his boot in the frozen grass. He was wearing the hat she'd given him, pulled down over his ears. I told her it didn't matter what I felt because you were leaving either way, so there wasn't a point in being sad about it ahead of time. She stood there with the winter air on her face and Eli in front of her saying the most heartbreaking thing she'd heard in 2 years in the flattest possible tone, and she didn't know what to say for a moment. That's a very practical approach, she managed. That's what she said too. He looked at her with his father's eyes. She'd seen the photo on the mantel, she knew. Is it true? That you're leaving in April? That's when my assignment ends, she said. That's not what I asked. 7 years old. He was 7 years old, and he asked questions like a man who'd already been disappointed enough times that he didn't see any reason to make it soft. I don't know yet, she said. It was the truest answer she had. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up one of the surveying flags she'd set down and turned it over in his hands, studying it. Grandma Ruth thinks you're going to go, he said. I know. Uncle Gideon doesn't say anything about it. He set down the flag. That's how I know he doesn't want you to. She looked at him. He goes quiet about things he doesn't want, Eli said, like he was explaining basic weather patterns. If he didn't care, he'd just say so. He picked up another flag, set it down. He went quiet about the barn roof for 2 months before he fixed it. Marin looked out across the field at the Hart house, visible from here, the smoke from the chimney, the truck in the yard, the bare arms of the apple tree catching the flat winter light. Eli, she said. Yeah. Has your grandmother said anything about taking you somewhere? You and Josie? She kept her voice careful, neutral. He went still. Just for a second, a small, quick stillness that he covered with another scuff of his boot. She mentioned Billings, he said. When? Last night. She thought I was asleep. He wasn't looking at her. She was talking to Uncle Gideon. She said Billings had a good school, better than here. He paused. She said it might be more stable. The word landed the same way it had when Caleb used it. Stability, like it was something the ranch couldn't provide. Like the thing the children needed was a different set of walls rather than the people already inside these ones. What did your uncle say? She asked. He He said no. Eli's voice was very flat. He said no, and then it got quiet, and then I fell asleep for real. She breathed out slowly. We're not going to Billings, Eli said, and it was hard to tell if it was a statement or a question or a thing he was saying to see how it sounded out loud. No, she said. You're not. He looked at her then. Really looked, with everything in him that was usually held back. How do you know? Because your uncle said no, she said. And he means it. Eli thought about this. Then he nodded, once, like she'd passed some kind of check she hadn't known she was being given, and picked up his backpack and headed back toward the house. Ruth found Gideon in the barn that evening. Maren didn't witness this. She learned about it later. Not from Gideon, who said almost nothing about it, but from the change in the house afterward, the particular quality of quiet that came between two people who have said things that needed to be said and are now figuring out how to exist alongside what was said. Ruth had asked him outright. She had laid it out the way she laid everything out. Plainly, without decoration, the way a woman does who has stopped seeing the point of preamble in her 70s. She'd asked him what exactly he thought was happening. She'd asked what he intended. She'd asked whether he understood the difference between someone being useful and someone being part of your family, and whether he was prepared for what happened to those children when the line between the two got blurred. And Gideon, who burned toast and woke at 4:30 and had spent 2 years learning how to braid hair from a YouTube video he'd never admit to watching, had said something that surprised her. He'd said, I know the difference, Mom. That's the problem. Ruth had gone quiet after that. The particular quiet she went when something got through. She left the next morning, early, before the kids were up. She came into the kitchen where Maren was already there. She was always there, and she stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at her. The bread, Ruth said. How do you make it rise properly? Mine always comes out flat. It was the strangest possible thing to ask. It was also, Maren understood somehow, exactly what it was. Not an olive branch so much as a very small door being left the tiniest fraction open. I let it go a full 2 hours, Maren said, sometimes more if the kitchen's cold. Ruth nodded. She looked around the kitchen one more time, at the dish towel on the rack, the breadboard, the books Eli had left on the counter, Josie's drawing of a horse stuck to the wall with a piece of tape. It's a good kitchen, she said, which meant something else entirely. Then she put on her coat and went out to her truck, and Gideon walked her out, and Maren stood at the window and watched them talk for a few minutes in the cold. Ruth speaking, Gideon listening, Ruth touching his arm in that firm, twice-patting way, and then getting into the truck. She drove away, and Gideon stood in the yard watching until she was gone. He came back in and poured himself coffee and stood at the counter. Is she all right? Maren asked. She's always all right, he said. That's never been her problem. He drank the coffee. She waited to see if there was more. She's going to think about things, he said. That's what she does. She thinks about things very thoroughly, and then she decides. And then she doesn't change her mind easily. What is she thinking about? He looked at her over the rim of the cup. You, he said. Just that. No elaboration. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she went back to making breakfast because it was what needed to happen next. And he stayed at the counter and didn't go anywhere. And that was also something. December arrived and the survey work moved into its most demanding phase. The disputed boundary line ran through terrain that didn't care about contracts or county schedules. Rocky, frozen ground that required more time and more care than the flat sections had. Maren was out in it every day, coming back to the cabin in the evenings with the particular ache of someone who'd been standing in cold wind for 8 hours. And she'd started coming to the ranch for dinner as often as breakfast. Not because she'd decided to, but because Josie had started saving her a seat. You don't say no to a 5-year-old who saves you a seat. Gideon knew this. She suspected he was counting on it. He never asked her to come. He just set a place. Started making enough for 4. Once she arrived and found that he'd made the potato soup she'd shown him how to make, which he'd previously claimed was too complicated, and he'd gotten it mostly right, which he seemed to find simultaneously satisfying and faintly irritating. It's good, she told him. The onions are too soft, he said. Gideon, it's good. Next time I'll add them later. Sure, she said. Next time. And just like that, without ceremony, next time became a thing they both knew was coming. It was the week before Christmas when Josie got sick. Not seriously. A fever, a cough, the ordinary winter illness of small children who put their hands on everything. But she was miserable with it, which made the house miserable, because Josie didn't suffer quietly. She suffered with the full vocal commitment of a child who believes everyone within earshot should be informed of her condition at all times. Gideon was wrecked by it in the way large, competent people are wrecked by small, sick children, perfectly capable of managing the physical requirements of the situation, completely undone by the sound of it. He sat at the edge of her bed at midnight, holding a damp cloth, and looking like a man confronting something he didn't have the tools for. And Marin, who'd come over when Gideon had appeared at her door, with an expression she'd never seen on him before, not quite panicked, not quite, had taken over the cloth and told him to go sleep for 3 hours. "I'm not going to sleep," he said. "You are," she said. "I'll stay." "She's not your—" "Gideon." She looked at him. "Go." He went. She stayed. She sat with Josie through the worst of the night, the 2 a.m. stretch when fevers like to peak, when the small body radiates heat and the child whimpers in a way that's specific to sickness and doesn't mean anything except that they feel terrible. She sang a little because Josie asked her to, and she wasn't a good singer, which Josie informed her of very directly, but she sang anyway, and by 3 a.m. the fever had broken and Josie was damp and limp and asleep. Marin sat in the chair beside the bed for a while after, not because she needed to, but because she wasn't ready to leave yet. She looked at Josie's face in the dim light, the way sleeping children look, all the daily intensity gone, just the face underneath it. The face that looked like Daniel's face, and Daniel's face looked like Gideon's, so in the still and quiet of 3 in the morning, she was looking at a version of something she'd come to know and couldn't anymore imagine not knowing. She thought about Ruth, about Caleb, about April. She thought about the apple tree. She got up very quietly and went out to the hall and almost walked into Gideon, who was standing there in the dark in his socks and yesterday's clothes, obviously not having slept at all. "I told you to rest," she said, keeping her voice low. "I know." He looked past her at Josie's door. "How is she?" "Better. Fever broke, she's asleep." He let out a breath that had clearly been held for hours. He looked exhausted in a way that went past tired into something structural, something about the whole long shape of the past 2 years. "Thank you," he said. He said it the way he'd said it the first time she cleaned his hand, like it cost him something to say, not because he wasn't grateful, but because accepting help was still new enough to feel difficult. "You don't have to thank me every time," she said. "I know that too." She looked at him in the dark hallway. He was close, closer than usual, the hallway being what it was. And in the quiet of the house at 3 a.m., with both of them tired and the crisis resolved, everything had a different quality to it. The usual distances between people went smaller. He said, "Marin," just her name, the way you say a name when you're trying to decide whether to say the rest of it. She waited. And then, because he was Gideon Hart, because he was a man who had spent his whole life making himself not need things, he didn't say the rest of it. He looked at her for a second with everything he hadn't said somewhere behind his eyes, and then he looked at the floor. "Get some sleep," he said. "You've been up all night." "So have you." "Yeah." He didn't argue it. "You can use the guest room. Don't drive back in the dark." "Okay," she said. She went to the guest room. She lay in the dark looking at the ceiling, listening to the house, the sounds of it, the familiar creaks and settlings of a building that had been through a lot of winters. She thought, he almost said it. She thought, so did I. She thought about April and about what it would feel like to pack a truck and drive away from this specific house, these specific children, this specific man who burned his toast and woke at 4:30 and was in the middle of carving her an apple out of wood. She thought about it for a long time. She didn't sleep for a while. In the first week of January, a letter arrived. It came addressed to Gideon, but the return address was a law firm in Billings, and Gideon stood at the kitchen counter holding it for a long moment before he opened it, and when he read it, something in his face went very still in a way she recognized as a different kind of still than usual. He set the letter down on the counter. He didn't say anything for a minute. Gideon, she said. He looked at her. My mother, he said, is filing for custody. The kitchen went quiet. Outside, the wind moved across the yard. Somewhere in the house, Eli's footsteps crossed the floor upstairs. The letter is from her lawyer, he said. His voice was flat, the going flat that meant the opposite of flat. She's citing instability of the home environment, inadequate supervision. He looked down at the letter, then back at her. She's citing you. Marin stood very still. Not by name, he said, but she's citing the presence of an unrelated adult in the home, the ambiguity of the arrangement. He stopped. Caleb Hurst is listed as a supporting witness. There it was. She'd known something was coming. She'd felt it in the way you feel weather before it arrives. A pressure change, a particular quality in the air. Ruth's visit, the questions, the dish towel, and the bread, and the door left barely open, and underneath all of it, a woman who loved those children enough to do something that would hurt everyone involved. She thought about Eli, standing in the cold field, saying she mentioned Billings in a voice that tried very hard to sound like he didn't care. She thought about Josie saving her a seat at the table. She thought about a wooden apple, half-carved, sitting in a barn corner where she wasn't supposed to have seen it. What are you going to do? She asked. Gideon picked up the letter and folded it once, clean, precise, the way he did things when he needed to feel like he had control of the shape of them. Fight it, he said. He said it simply, the way you state something that was never in question. I'm going to fight it. She nodded. But Marin. He looked at her with everything on the surface now, all the restraint he usually kept in place worn down by one letter on one January morning. If you're planning to leave in April, if that's still... He stopped. Started again. I need to know. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the apple tree stood bare in the January cold, every branch visible, nothing hidden, rooted in the frozen ground like something that had decided. She looked at Gideon Hart, who asked for nothing, who managed everything alone, who burned his toast and woke at 4:30 and had spent 2 years being exactly what those children needed, even when it cost him everything else. She thought of what she'd said to Caleb on a cold November morning that felt like a different life now. Then why did I plant an apple tree? She'd known then. She'd known, and she hadn't let herself know it. But she'd known. She met his eyes. I'm not planning anything, she said. And then, because that wasn't enough, because he deserved more than almost. I'm not leaving, Gideon. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face. Not relief, not quite, but the thing that lives under relief, the thing that was there before relief had anything to relieve. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He picked up his coffee cup, and he looked out the window at the yard, and after a moment he said, very quietly, I should check on the trough before it freezes over. You should, she said. He put on his coat and went outside, and she stood at the window and watched him cross the yard in the cold morning light, and she pressed her hand flat against the cold glass for just a second. It was January. Spring was still 3 months away. It had never felt farther. It had never felt less like something she was afraid of. She didn't tell the children about the letter. She and Gideon made that decision together, which was itself something. The quiet way they'd fallen into making decisions together, without ceremony, without anyone formally establishing that this was how things worked now. It had just become how things worked. She'd look at him, and he'd look at her, and some understanding would pass between them that didn't require words, and then they'd do the next thing. The next thing, in this case, was finding a lawyer. Harlow Creek did not have a family law attorney. The closest one was in a town called Ridgeback, 40 miles east, a woman named Patricia Okafor, who had a small practice above a hardware store, and who, when Gideon called her, listened to the summary of the situation in silence and then said, Come in Thursday, bring everything. Gideon brought everything. Marin drove because his truck had been making a sound in the engine that he'd been meaning to look at for 2 weeks, and her county truck ran clean. They went on a Thursday morning after the kids left for school, and they sat across from Patricia Okafor in her small office that smelled of wood and old paper, and they told the whole thing. Patricia was 50-something, sharp-eyed, with reading glasses she took on and off repeatedly while she looked at the documents. She read the custody filing. She read it again. She asked questions with the particular efficiency of someone who doesn't have time for anything except what matters. "How long has the grandmother been involved in the children's daily care?" she asked. "She wasn't," Gideon said. "She lives in Billings. She visited a few times a year." "And the children's mother?" "Gone." His voice went flat. "Left when Josie was 3. No contact since." Patricia noted this. The filing cites instability of the home environment. "What specifically?" "Me," Marin said. Patricia looked at her. "The filing is about me," Marin said, "about the ambiguity of my role. A man named Caleb Hurst is listed as a supporting witness. He's a community member who's had concerns about my presence at the ranch since I arrived." "What kind of concerns?" "The kind that men like him dress up as concern for children," Marin said, "when what they actually mean is that a woman living near a widower without a ring on her finger makes them uncomfortable." Patricia looked at her for a moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved very slightly. "All right," she said. "What's your timeline with the county assignment?" "April 1st. "And after that?" Marin looked at Gideon. He was looking at his hands on the table, the same hands she'd wrapped in a kitchen. The cut long healed now, but the memory of it still there. "I'm staying," she said. Patricia noted this too. "In what capacity?" The question sat between them like something that had been waiting to be asked for a long time. In what capacity? It was the legal version of the thing that had been left unsaid in a hallway at 3 in the morning. The thing they'd been navigating around for weeks like furniture in a dark room they both knew was there. Gideon looked up from his hands. He looked at Marin. "We'll need to figure that out," he said, "before April." Patricia looked between them with the expression of a woman who had been doing this work long enough to recognize a conversation happening underneath a conversation. She didn't push. She wrote something down and moved on. "Here's where we stand," she said. "The grandmother has legal standing to file, but the bar for overturning an existing guardianship is high. She'll need to demonstrate that the current arrangement is actively harmful to the children. Unstable isn't enough by itself. Caleb Hurst's opinion of your domestic arrangements is not evidence." She set down her pen. "What will matter is the children's relationship with each guardian, their day-to-day welfare, their schooling, their health. The judge will likely request a home assessment." "When?" Gideon asked. "Could be as early as March, depending on the court's calendar." "March. 2 months away. 2 months before April, before the county assignment ended, before all the things that had been quietly building in that house arrived at whatever they were going to arrive at." Gideon nodded. He was doing the thing where his face went very still when he was calculating something. "What do we need to do?" "Document everything," Patricia said. "School records, medical visits, daily routines, letters from the children's teachers, anything that demonstrates the stability of the home environment." She looked at Marin. "And Miss Ellis, your presence at the ranch will be scrutinized. I won't pretend otherwise. Whatever your role is, it needs to be clear. Ambiguity is what the opposing counsel will use." Marin nodded. They drove home in the county truck through 40 miles of frozen Montana landscape, and for the first stretch of it, neither of them said anything. The radio was off. The heater worked too hard and made a slight whining sound she'd been meaning to report to the county office. Gideon spoke first. "I'm sorry," he said, "that you're in the middle of this. I put myself in the middle of it. I let you." He was looking out the windshield. "I kept letting you come to breakfast and come to dinner and help with the kids, and I told myself I wasn't asking anything of you, but I was. I just wasn't saying it out loud." She was quiet for a moment. The road ran straight through the frozen fields. "What were you asking?" she said. He didn't answer right away. She let the silence hold. "To stay," he said. Just that. She kept her eyes on the road. Her hands were steady on the wheel. "You should have said so," she said. "I know." "Earlier." "I know that too." He shifted in the seat. I'm not good at saying things. You've probably noticed. Once or twice. I thought if I said it and you left anyway, that would be..." He stopped, looked out the side window. "The kids. I didn't want them to see me ask someone to stay and have them leave." She understood that. She understood it in her chest, where it landed with the specific weight of something true. Eli thinks you go quiet about things you don't want, she said. Gideon made a sound that was almost a laugh. Does he? He's been watching. I know he has. He rubbed his face with one hand. He watches everything. He's been doing it since the day they came to live with me, like he's waiting to see how bad it's going to get. He paused. I've tried to show him it doesn't have to keep getting bad. You have, she said. You have been. He looked at her then. She could feel it without turning her head. So have you, he said. She didn't say anything. She drove. 40 miles, and neither of them said anything else, and it wasn't the silence of things unsaid. It was the silence of things that were said and didn't need repeating. She told Eli about the custody case, in the end. Not the details, not the legal language, not the name of the lawyer, not the specifics of what Ruth had filed. But enough. She told him because she thought he probably already knew something, because he was the kind of child who picked things up from the air around adults, who could read a room the way some kids could read books. Intuitively, quickly, without being taught. And because she thought he deserved to know that things were being handled, rather than walking around sensing that something was wrong and not being told what. She found him on the porch one afternoon after school, sitting on the top step with his knees up, not reading for once, just looking at the yard. She sat down next to him. He didn't say anything. She said, Your grandmother filed something with the court. She wants to talk to a judge about where you and Josie live. Eli was quiet for a moment. About taking us to Billings? About whether Billings might be better for you. He looked at the yard, at the apple tree, at the barn, at the cattle visible in the far pasture. He looked at it all with the expression of someone checking inventory. It's not, he said. I know. I don't want to go to Billings. I know that too. Does Josie know? No, and I'd like to keep it that way for now. She's 5. He nodded. He got that. Is Uncle Gideon worried? He's handling it. Are you? She looked at him. Am I worried? No. He picked at a loose thread on his jacket sleeve. Are you handling it with him? Like, are you part of it? She thought about how to answer that. She thought about Patricia Okafor asking in what capacity, and Gideon saying, We'll need to figure that out. Yes, she said. I'm part of it. Eli pulled the thread and then stopped himself before it unraveled too far. He looked at it for a second. Then, Okay, he said, like she'd answered something more than what he'd asked, like he'd been asking something more than what he'd said. He went inside, and Maren sat on the porch steps alone for a while, and the cold settled around her, and the apple tree stood bare and small and still rooted, and she thought about all the ways a decision could be made before you knew you were making it. Quote, February came in mean. There was a storm in the first week, 3 days of it, sustained and serious, the kind that shut the road to Ridgeback and kept the kids home from school and left the ranch cut off from town in a way that wasn't dangerous but was relentless. The cattle needed tending twice a day. The barn roof leaked where the snow loaded up on the weak section, and Gideon dealt with it using a bucket and a curse word he immediately apologized for because Josie heard it and repeated it, which caused a brief household crisis. Maren moved into the ranch for those 3 days without anyone formally suggesting it. Her cabin heat was less reliable than the ranch stove, and more practically, there was too much work for one person when the weather got like this. She slept in the guest room that had been Ruth's, and she helped with the cattle and the water and the meals and the children's ongoing education, which did not pause for weather because Eli refused to fall behind on his reading, and Josie had decided that a storm was the ideal time to learn everything she'd been putting off learning. On the second night, after the children were in bed and the storm hadn't let up, she and Gideon sat at the kitchen table with coffee and the low sound of wind outside that reminded her of nothing so much as something trying to get in that couldn't. He'd been quieter than usual all day. Not the working quiet, not the normal version, the kind where something was sitting with him. She waited it out. Ruth called this morning, he said finally. Before you got up. She wrapped her hands around her cup. And? She wants to come to the ranch again, before the assessment. He looked at the table. I think she wants to see it without Caleb in her ear. She said she'd come alone. Maren considered this. Are you going to let her? She's their grandmother, he said. She loves them. She's doing this wrong, but she loves them. He rubbed the back of his neck. Yeah, I'm going to let her. When? She's thinking late February. Maren nodded. She turned her cup slowly in her hands. She's going to look at me differently this time, she said. Now that there's a legal thing. Probably. I want to be here when she comes. He looked at her. I wasn't going to suggest otherwise. I know, I'm just saying it out loud. He nodded. He drank his coffee. Outside, the wind pushed at the windows and found no way through. Patricia called too, he said. She's filed the response to the petition. She says our position is strong, but she wants, He stopped. What? She wants clarity on your role before the assessment. He said it to the table, not to her. Legal clarity. She says ambiguity is the thing Ruth's lawyer will use and we need to remove it. The kitchen was quiet except for the storm. Gideon, she said. He looked up. She'd thought about how to say this. She'd been thinking about it since the drive back from Ridgeback, since the porch steps with Eli, since 3 in the morning in a dark hallway that kept coming back to her. I'm not going to make this easier for you by pretending I don't understand what Patricia means, she said, and I'm not going to make it harder for you by pretending I don't know what I want. She held his gaze. So I'm just going to say it plainly. He was very still. I want to stay, she said, not because of the legal situation, not because of the children, though I love those children and that's real, but because she stopped, made herself say it without covering it up. Because this is the first place in 3 years that has felt like something I don't want to leave. And you're the reason for that. Not just the ranch. Not just the kids. She paused. You. The storm outside. The quiet kitchen. The small sounds of the house. Gideon put down his coffee cup. He looked at her with everything in him that was usually somewhere behind his eyes, now plainly on the surface. I carved you an apple, he said. She stared at him. I've been working on it since October, he said, which is, I know that's not, He made a short sound, almost exasperated with himself. I didn't know how to say any of this, so I just kept carving the thing, and it's still not done because every time I think it's done, I find something wrong with it. She thought she might be about to cry, which was not what she intended. She held it back. It's applewood, he said, from a branch that came down in September. I thought, because of the tree. He looked at the table. It was a stupid idea. It's not a stupid idea, she said. It's not finished. Gideon. She waited until he looked at her. Finish it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his face settled. Not relaxed exactly, because he wasn't a man who relaxed easily, but settled, like a thing that has been out of alignment being put back. Okay, he said. That was all. That was enough. She picked up her coffee cup and he picked up his, and outside the storm kept going, and inside the kitchen was warm, and they sat there for another hour talking about smaller things. The cattle, the barn, whether Josie's obsession with horse drawings was the start of an actual interest or just a phase. And the smaller things felt enormous in the way small things do when the large thing has finally been said. Bammas. Ruth came on a Saturday in the 3rd week of February. She came alone, as she'd promised, and she came without warning Gideon of the exact time, which meant Maren was already in the kitchen when the truck came into the yard, already making lunch, already part of the house, in the way she was always part of the house by that point. Ruth came in, and she looked around the kitchen, and she saw the lunch being made and the dish towel on the rack, and Josie's horse drawing still taped to the wall. There were more of them now, a whole line of them like a gallery, and Eli's books on the counter, and the breadboard, and the particular organized chaos of a kitchen that was actually being used. She took off her coat. She said, "Can I help?" Maren handed her a knife and the potatoes without making anything of it. They worked side by side for a while, and Josie came in and immediately began telling Ruth about the horses and the storm and the curse word that Gideon had said and immediately apologized for, and Ruth listened to all of it with her full attention the way she always did. Eli came in, looked at Ruth, said, "Hi, Grandma," and got himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. Ruth looked at him. "How's the reading?" "Good." He drank his water. "I finished the boat book." "And?" He considered it. "He builds the boat. he said, and then he sails somewhere. And it's hard, but he does it. A pause. It was good. Ruth looked at him for a moment with something moving through her face that she was trying not to show. She went back to the potatoes. Gideon came in from the barn and stopped when he saw his mother, and they did the arm-patting thing, twice, firm. And then he sat down, and the lunch happened around the table the way lunch happened in that house, which was to say, imperfectly and noisily, and with Josie eating around the edges of things. After, Gideon took the children out to the barn for afternoon chores, the way he always did on Saturdays, and Maren and Ruth did the dishes the way they had before. For a while, Ruth said nothing. Then, Gideon looks different than he did in November. Maren kept washing. Different how? Ruth was quiet for a moment. She dried a glass, held it up to check it for spots the way she did. Less like a man carrying something by himself, she said. Maren didn't answer. I made a mistake, Ruth said. She said it the way people say things they've been working up to, directly, without preamble, but waited. With the filing, with Caleb. She set down the glass. I was afraid. I handled it wrong. Maren turned off the water. She turned to look at Ruth. The older woman met her eyes. I was afraid of watching those children attach themselves to someone and then lose them, she said. I've watched them lose enough. I thought if I could get ahead of it, if I could control the situation. She stopped. That's not love. I know that's not love. It's fear wearing the costume of love, and I know the difference. Maren looked at her, at this small, white-haired, fiercely proud woman who had buried a son and was terrified of any further subtraction from her life. You don't have to tell me this, Maren said. Yes, I do. Ruth held her gaze. Because I need to know something, and I can only ask you if I've been honest with you first. Maren waited. Are you staying? Ruth asked. Plain, undecorated, the way she asked everything. Yes, Maren said. I'm staying. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. She was reading something in Maren's face, checking it against what she'd seen all afternoon, all morning, against the dish towel on the rack and the lunch, and the way Eli had leaned against the counter and Josie had told the story about the curse word to someone who felt like family. All right, Ruth said. One nod, like a thing decided. She picked up the dish towel and went back to drying. The bread, she said. Full 2 hours even in a cold kitchen? Even then, Maren said. Longer if you have to. Ruth nodded. I'll try it again. They finished the dishes. Outside, through the kitchen window, Maren could see Gideon and the children crossing the yard from the barn, Josie on Gideon's shoulders, Eli walking beside him doing something with his hands that suggested he was explaining something complicated. The winter light was flat and pale, and it made the yard look like a photograph. And then Josie laughed at something, and the photograph became real again. Ruth was watching too. He's a better father than he knows, she said. She said it quietly, like she was saying it to herself as much as to Maren. I know, Maren said. Ruth looked at her. For the first time, something in the older woman's face went fully open. Not the careful, assessing look, not the guarded concern, but something that was underneath everything, simply glad. Good, Ruth said. She set down the dish towel and went to put on her coat. And when Gideon came in with Josie still on his shoulders and Eli explaining something about weight distribution that he'd apparently read about, Ruth reached up and patted Josie's foot and said she needed to start the drive back before it got dark. Josie immediately protested this at length. Gideon carried Josie to the door to say goodbye, and Ruth kissed the girl's cheek and told Eli to keep reading and patted Gideon's arm 3 times instead of 2, which Maren noticed, and which Gideon noticed too. She could see it in the way he held still under it. Ruth stopped at the door and looked back at Maren. Thank you for lunch, she said. Come back, Maren said. Whenever. Ruth nodded. She went out to her truck. She drove away in the pale winter light, and this time nobody stood watching until she was gone. Josie was already asking about dessert. Gideon set her down and looked at Maren over her head with a question in his eyes. She gave him the smallest nod. He understood. She saw him understand. He went to put the kettle on, and Josie followed him talking about dessert, and Eli picked up a book, and Maren stood in the kitchen of the Hart Ranch in the last light of a February afternoon, thinking that this This exact, unglamorous, imperfect, entirely ordinary moment was what she had been driving away from for 3 years without knowing it was what she was looking for. What? The home assessment happened on a Thursday in early March. A woman named Carol Sims came from the County Family Services office with a clipboard and the particularly neutral expression of someone trained to reveal nothing. She walked through the house. She looked at the bedrooms, Eli's, with his books stacked in a specific order he'd apparently put a lot of thought into. Josie's, with the drawings taped above the bed, a whole sky of horses. She looked at the kitchen, the yard, the barn. She spoke to Gideon for 45 minutes. She spoke to Eli for 20. She spoke to Josie for 15, which was about how long any conversation with Josie could be directed before she steered it toward horses. She spoke to Marin for 30 minutes, and she asked questions that had teeth in them. About Thomas, about the county assignment, about April, about what Marin's plans were, and on what basis those plans were made. Marin answered every question honestly. At the end, Carol Sims stood on the porch and looked out at the yard, at the cattle in the far field, at the barn and the house and the weathered truck, at the apple tree. "That's a young tree," she said. "We planted it in October," Marin said. "We," Carol said. "Me and the children," Marin said. "And Gideon." Carol noted it. She noted everything, which was her job, and she did her job carefully and without expression, and she shook everyone's hand and got in her car and drove away. They wouldn't hear back for 3 weeks. Those 3 weeks were the longest Marin could remember since the months after Thomas died. The slow, thick quality of waiting for something you can't control, the way time moves differently when you're inside uncertainty. She worked. She finished the survey. She made breakfast and dinner and helped with schoolwork and repaired a fence section that Gideon hadn't gotten to and didn't ask for credit for any of it. Gideon finished the apple. He put it on the kitchen table one morning without ceremony. Just set it there next to the breadboard, carved smooth and small, pale wood with the particular warm grain of apple wood, shaped like the thing it was meant to be. Not perfect. One side was slightly flatter than the other, and the stem was a little off-center, and it was exactly the right amount of imperfect. She picked it up. It fit in her palm the way she'd imagined it would, back in October when she'd found it in the barn and hadn't said anything. "It's off-center," he said. "I know. I tried to fix it 3 times. "Don't fix it," she said. "Leave it." He looked at her. "It's right," she said. "Leave it how it is." He didn't argue. She set it back down on the table, and there it stayed, between the breadboard and the coffee cups, between the ordinary things of an ordinary morning, like it had always been there. The letter from Patricia came on a Wednesday. Gideon read it standing at the counter. Then he read it again. Then he set it down and stood there looking at it. "Gideon," Marin said. He looked up. Something in his face had given way, not broken, but opened, the way ground opens in spring when it's been frozen too long. "Ruth withdrew the petition," he said. 3 days ago, Patricia just got confirmation. Marin put down what she was holding. "She withdrew it," he said again, like he was making sure the words were real. She crossed the kitchen and stood next to him and read the letter herself. It was legal language, dry and specific, but inside it was Ruth Hart deciding, on her own, before the assessment results came back, before anyone made her, that she'd been wrong, that what was in that house was not instability, that what was in that house was exactly what her grandchildren needed. Josie came downstairs at that moment, still in her pajamas, hair stuck up on one side, carrying a drawing she'd apparently finished the night before. "I made a horse with a hat," she announced, "because it's cold." She held up the drawing. The horse was wearing what appeared to be a very large hat with a significant brim. Gideon took the drawing from her and looked at it very seriously. "That's a good hat," he said. "I know." Josie took it back. "I'm going to tape it up." She went to the wall where the others were and pressed it into place with both palms, considering placement. Marin looked at Gideon. He looked at her. The letter was on the counter. The wooden apple was on the table. Outside, the March morning was doing what March mornings in Montana do, threatening and relenting and threatening again. The season not yet committed to anything. The ground still hard, but not as hard as it had been. The apple tree was still bare. But Marin had read about apple trees. She knew what she was looking for. In a few weeks, if the season turned, if the cold let up enough, if the ground thawed enough, if all the small necessary conditions aligned, there would be buds. Not fruit, not yet, just the beginning of the possibility of it. She thought that was probably enough. Gideon reached across the space between them and took her hand. He didn't say anything. He just held it, standing there in the kitchen with the letter on the counter, and Josie taping a horse and a hat to the wall and the morning coming in through the window, pale and cold and slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to change. He held her hand for maybe 30 seconds. Then Josie announced she was hungry, and the moment dissolved the way moments in that house always dissolved, into the next necessary thing, into oatmeal and juice and the small negotiations of a morning with children in it. But Marin felt the weight of those 30 seconds for the rest of the day, carrying them around the way you carry something small and solid in your pocket, knowing it's there even when you're not thinking about it. March moved through the valley the way it always did in that part of Montana, reluctantly, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, warm enough on Tuesday to make you believe in it, and then cold again by Thursday like it had reconsidered. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, then the yard, then the fields, leaving behind the particular muddy chaos of a working ranch in early spring. The cattle moved differently when the ground thawed. The dog biscuit, who had spent most of winter in front of the stove with the dignified inertia of a very old animal, began making his way to the porch again in the afternoons. The apple tree got its buds. They came in the last week of March. Small, tight, the reddish green of something just deciding to exist. Josie found them first because Josie found everything first, being a child with no particular agenda except paying attention to whatever was directly in front of her. She came running in from the yard one Saturday morning with her boots still unlaced, shouting that the tree had things on it. "Come look, it has things." They all went out. Even Gideon, who knew perfectly well what apple buds looked like, went out and stood in the yard and looked at the tree with the rest of them. "It's alive," Josie said, with the absolute satisfaction of someone whose confidence has been confirmed. "It was always alive," Eli said. "We didn't know that for sure." "I did." "You did not, Eli." "I was pretty sure." Marin stood between them with her hands in her coat pockets, looking at the buds. They were not impressive by any objective measure, small and tentative, the sort of thing that could still be killed by a late frost if the season turned mean again. The tree itself was still barely taller than Josie with her arms up. It would be years before it gave anything worth calling fruit. She knew that. She'd known it when they planted it. That had never been the point. Gideon was standing just behind her. She could feel it without turning around. He'd been different since the morning the letter came. Not dramatically different, not in the way of grand gestures or suddenly becoming someone who talked easily about what he felt. He was still himself, quiet, deliberate, burning his toast with reliable consistency. But something had come down in him, some permanent bracing against an impact that was no longer coming. "It's going to need water," he said from behind her. She agreed. "The south side especially dries out faster." "I know. I'll put a drip line in when the ground's ready." She turned around and looked at him. He was looking at the tree, but he felt her looking and met her eyes. And for a second they just stood there in the cold spring yard with the children arguing about certainty beside them, and the whole of what they'd been through sitting between them like something they'd built together and could both see. He almost smiled. She did. What? Her county contract ended on April 1st, which was a Tuesday. She drove the county truck to the regional office in Ridgeback that morning, filed her final survey report, handed over the equipment and the keys, and signed the paperwork that ended her official reason for being in Harlow Creek. The woman at the front desk thanked her, asked if she'd be available for the summer survey season, and Marin said she didn't think so. She thought she was going to stay where she was for a while. The woman looked mildly curious about this, but didn't ask. Marin drove back to Harlow Creek in her own car, the one she'd kept in Ridgeback since September, the one that had been waiting all this time like a question she wasn't ready to answer. She drove it down the main road of Harlow Creek and past the general store and past the Methodist church, where Caleb Hurst had plotted his small, righteous campaign against her. And she turned down the county road toward the Hart Ranch, and she parked on her side of the fence out of habit. Then she got out, and she picked up the 2 bags she'd packed that morning, and she walked through the fence gap that she and the children and the dog had been using since October, and she set the bags down on Gideon's side. She stood there for a second. The yard was quiet. Gideon was in the barn. She could hear him moving around in there, the sound of it familiar now as her own breathing. The children were at school. Biscuit was on the porch, watching her with the ancient, unimpressed gaze of a dog who has seen most things. She picked up the bags and carried them to the house. She put them in the guest room for now, not because she thought of it as a permanent arrangement, but because there were conversations still to be had, and she was not a person who acted ahead of conversations. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table. She looked at the wooden apple on the table, slightly off-center stem and all, and she thought about Thomas, which she still did, which she had made her peace with doing. She thought about the 18 months they'd had, and the way grief had followed her from town to town for 3 years, like weather she couldn't get out ahead of, and the way it had finally run out of road here, in this valley, at this table. She didn't think Thomas would have begrudged her this. He had been, above all other things, someone who believed people should stay where they were wanted. She thought he'd have liked Gideon. She thought he'd have found Eli's seriousness funny in the affectionate way. She thought he'd have been completely undone by Josie. She heard Gideon's boots on the porch, the door, and then he was in the kitchen, and he stopped when he saw the 2 bags she hadn't fully brought into the guest room, one of them still visible through the doorway. He looked at the bags. He looked at her. "April 1st, she said. "I know what day it is," he said. "I returned the truck." "I know. I watched you drive in with the other car." He hadn't moved from the doorway. He was holding his hat in his hands the way he'd held it the very first time he came to her fence, that first evening when he'd come to apologize for Josie. "You put the bags on my side of the fence." "I did. Not the cabin side." "No." He stood there. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the yard, the tree, the wide Montana sky doing what it did in early April, blue and cold and impossibly large. "I need to say something to you," he said. "Okay." He looked at his hat, then at her. "I'm not good at this. You know that." "I know. But I've been thinking about it since January, since the drive back from Ridgeback, about what to say and how to say it without—" He stopped, tried again. "Without sounding like I'm asking you to stay for the wrong reasons. Because of the kids. Because of the case. Because it's convenient." "I know it's not that," she said. "I need to say it anyway." He set down his hat on the counter. "Marin, I have been since sometime in October, probably since the morning I came to the fence and you told me Josie wasn't a bother. I've been trying not to need you, because needing people is how you lose them, and I had already lost enough." He looked at her with everything that was usually held somewhere behind him now, just on the surface, plain as the yard outside. "I stopped being able to not need you somewhere around November. I don't know exactly when. It wasn't a decision. It just happened." She didn't say anything. She let him finish. "I can't offer you something simple," he said. "I've got 2 kids who have already had too much taken from them, and a ranch that's always going to need more work than it gets. And I wake up at 4:30 in the morning because I genuinely can't not, and I'm going to burn the toast forever because I cannot fix that particular thing about myself." He paused. "But I want you here. Not because it's practical. Because it's you." Another pause. "I love you. That's what I'm saying. I've probably loved you since November, and I'm sorry it took me this long to say it out loud." The kitchen was very still. She stood up from the table. She crossed the kitchen floor, which had a board that creaked slightly on the left side, which she knew now the way she knew everything about this house, and she stopped in front of him. "Gideon," she said. "Yeah. I know you burned the toast on purpose." He blinked. "I don't—" "You pressed the lever down twice. I've watched you. You know the stove runs hot, and you press it down twice anyway because you're thinking about something else, and then you're surprised every time." She looked at him. "You're not surprised. You've just accepted that this is what happens now." He opened his mouth, closed it. "I love you too," she said. "I've loved you since approximately the morning you apologized for Josie being kind to me, which is a strange thing to love someone for, but here we are. He looked at her for a second with the slightly stunned expression of a man who had prepared himself for a longer negotiation. Then he put his hand on the side of her face, and she leaned into it, and he pressed his forehead against hers, and they stood there in the kitchen, in the ordinary morning light, not saying anything else, because everything necessary had been said. Outside, Biscuit got up from the porch, turned around twice, and lay back down. They got married in June, not because June was romantic in some abstract way, but because June was when the ranch work settled into a manageable rhythm and the ground was reliably dry, and Josie had been asking, with escalating frequency, when the wedding was going to happen since approximately 5 minutes after Gideon told the children he'd asked Maren to marry him. He'd told them on a Wednesday evening in April at dinner, with the directness he applied to everything. "I asked Maren to marry me," he said. "She said yes. I wanted you to know." Josie put down her fork. She looked at Maren. She looked at Gideon. She looked back at Maren. "So you're going to be here forever?" she said. "That's the plan," Maren said. Josie picked her fork back up and went back to eating with the air of someone who has received exactly the information she required and is now ready to move on. "Good," she said, "because I need someone to do my hair in the mornings, and Uncle Gideon is really bad at it." Gideon made a sound of protest. "You are," Eli said, without looking up from his food. "It's objectively bad." "I've been doing it for 2 years." "And it's been bad for 2 years," Eli said. He looked up then, and there was something in his face, a brightness that he didn't usually let out all the way, a kid underneath the seriousness of him, the kid who'd been carefully managing his expectations of the world for so long that he'd almost forgotten he was still just 8 years old. "I'm glad," he said. Simple, like he'd finally decided the thing was safe enough to say. Gideon looked at him. "Me too, bud," he said. "Me too." Ruth came for the wedding. She drove herself from Billings, arrived the afternoon before with a casserole and a set of dish towels she'd ordered from a catalog, which she gave to Maren with the matter-of-fact air of a woman presenting a practical gift to someone she'd decided to accept. "They're a better weight than the ones you have," Ruth said. "I checked." "Thank you, Ruth. Don't fold them in thirds, fold them in half and then in half again. They hang better." "I'll remember that." Ruth looked around the kitchen, which was the same kitchen and also different from the one she'd first stood in. Josie's drawings had expanded to cover an entire wall now, horses in every configuration imaginable. And there were more books, and the breadboard had a groove worn into it from months of use, and the wooden apple sat on the table where it had always sat since Gideon put it there in March. Ruth picked it up. She turned it over in her hands the way Maren had in October when she found it in the barn. "He spent 3 months on this," Ruth said. "I know. He used to make things when he was a boy. Stopped when he got older." She set it down. "I'm glad he started again." She helped with the wedding preparations in the way she helped with everything, with complete competence and firm opinions about the correct method, and a willingness to do the actual work that Maren had come to appreciate deeply. They spent the afternoon before the ceremony in the kitchen together, making food for the small gathering of people who would come, and it was the most natural thing in the world, and also something neither of them had anticipated back in November when they'd done dishes in a silence that could have gone either way. People could surprise you. That was the thing, even people you'd already decided about. The ceremony happened in the yard, not in a church, not in any rented venue, in the actual yard of the Hart Ranch, on a Saturday in June when the sky was the kind of clear that felt like a promise the weather was actually going to keep. Patricia Okafor came, which no one had expected but which seemed fitting. The Harlow Creek neighbors who'd always been decent, who'd fed the children when Gideon was sick in the first year and left things at the gate without making a production of it, they came. A handful of people who'd worked alongside Maren on the county survey, and Ruth, standing near the back in her good coat, with an expression she was controlling carefully that was nevertheless, underneath the control, simply moved. Caleb Hurst was not there. Nobody had mentioned him in some time. He had the particular fate of men who spend their energy making other people's lives difficult. He'd been found to have a boundary dispute of his own on his east property, which occupied most of his spring and whatever authority he'd appointed himself in Harlow Creek, had quietly diminished in the months since Patricia Okafor's letter had made clear that his involvement in the Hart custody situation had been both unwelcome and ineffective. He still came to the general store. He still had opinions. He'd just run out of leverage to attach them to. Gideon wore the good shirt that Eli had informed him, very seriously, was the one he should wear. He stood in the yard in the June light and watched Marin come across it toward him, and had the expression of a man who can't believe his luck, which was the right expression for the occasion. She'd done her own hair. Josie had asked to help with it, and the asking had been so sincere that Marin had said yes, and the result was a small braid on one side that was somewhat uneven, which she wore anyway, which was the correct decision. They said what they meant to each other without flourish, because that was who they both were. She said she was staying. He said he knew. She said she was going to keep saying it, every day, until it wasn't something that needed to be said anymore and just became something they both knew. He said that was the best thing he'd ever heard. He put the ring on her finger. It had been his grandmother's, which Ruth had brought in a small box and handed to Gideon the morning before with 2 firm pats on his arm and nothing else said. It was a plain gold band, slightly worn, the kind of ring that had a life behind it and was ready to have more. Josie cried, which surprised everyone, including Josie. Eli didn't cry, but he stood very straight the whole time with his hands at his sides and his hat on, the one Marin had given him in October, which he still wore. And when it was done and they were married, he walked over to Marin and stood in front of her and said, "Okay," in a voice that was steady, in the way only a kid who's had to be steady for too long can be. And she pulled him in and held on, and he let her. That was the moment she remembered most, afterward. Not the ring, not the words, the particular way Eli Hart said "okay" and let himself be held. The fence came down that summer. Not all of it. The property lines still existed, the surveys still mattered, the county records still showed 2 parcels of land with a boundary between them, but the fence that had run between the Hart Ranch and the cabin, the one she'd watched from her porch on the first morning, the one Josie had gone through to show her a dead bird, the one Gideon had come to on a September evening with his hat in his hands. That fence came down. Gideon pulled the posts himself on a Saturday in July with Eli helping and Josie supervising and Marin bringing water out every hour because the July heat had opinions. It took most of the day. The posts were deeper than they'd looked, anchored in the kind of ground that doesn't give anything up easily. When the last one came out, Eli stood in the gap where the fence had been and looked from one side to the other like he was checking something. "It's the same," he said. "What is?" Gideon asked, wiping the back of his neck with a cloth. "Both sides." Eli looked at the ground. "The grass is the same on both sides. I thought there'd be a difference." "It was just a fence," Gideon said. Eli looked at him. "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." Gideon looked at his nephew for a second, at this 9-year-old who had come to live with him as a 7-year-old who couldn't sleep and had become something different. Still serious, still careful, but carrying it lighter now, the way you carry something when you're not carrying it alone. "Yeah," Gideon said. "You're right." They pulled the last of the posts and stacked the wire. And by evening, the yard was 1 yard, the way it should have been from the start. The cabin now part of the property rather than a thing next to it. The apple tree rooted in soil that belonged to all of them. The years move through the ranch the way years do when you're inside them. Faster than you expect, slower than you want, marked by the things that stick rather than the days themselves. Josie's drawings stayed on the kitchen wall until the kitchen got repainted, and then Marin carefully photographed every single one before they came down and printed them and put them in a book with Josie's name on the cover, which Josie received at 7 years old with the dignified satisfaction of someone who had always suspected her work deserved archiving. Eli read his way through everything Marin put on the fence and then through the school library and then started writing things himself. Careful, precise, the same focused quality he brought to everything. He showed Marin a story he'd written when he was 10, handing her the notebook with the studied casualness of someone who was absolutely watching for her reaction. She read it at the kitchen table while he pretended to do something else. And it was good. Not good for a kid, just good, with the kind of specific detail that came from someone who'd been paying close attention to the world for a long time. She told him so. He nodded like he'd filed the information and went back to what he was pretending to do. but she saw him press his mouth together in the way he did when something mattered. Gideon fixed the barn roof properly. He replaced the fence posts on the eastern pasture. He bought 2 more cattle the second year and 4 more the year after that, and the ranch moved from something that was being maintained to something that was actually growing, which was a different feeling in the body, less like holding a wall up and more like watching something go. He still woke at 4:30. He probably always would. But now when he came in for breakfast, there was coffee already made, and someone already at the table, and the sound of children overhead, and the difference between the 4:30 of before and the 4:30 of after was the difference between doing something because you're afraid of what happens if you don't, and doing it because you want the day to start. Ruth came for Christmas both years, and then started coming for Thanksgiving too, arriving with opinions about the turkey and dish towels she'd decided they needed, and a bag of books for Eli that she'd chosen herself at a bookstore in Billings, with the particular seriousness of a grandmother who takes a child's reading very seriously. She and Marin had the kind of relationship that had been built on honesty rather than comfort, which meant it was occasionally pointed and almost always real. She never apologized for the custody filing again. She didn't need to. She showed up instead, every holiday, every school event she could drive for, every birthday. And that was its own form of saying the thing. Cha-cha. The apple tree gave fruit for the first time in its 4th year. Not much. 8 apples, small, slightly lopsided, with the tart skin of an immature tree that was still figuring itself out. Josie picked them all on a September morning before anyone could suggest waiting, which was entirely consistent with who Josie was, and brought them to the kitchen in the front of her shirt. "There's 8, she said, setting them on the counter, with the careful triumph of a 9-year-old who has been watching this tree for 4 years and is not going to pretend this is a small thing. Marin picked one up. It was small enough to fit entirely in her palm, lighter than it looked. She turned it over, slightly lopsided, just like the wooden one on the table. She looked at the wooden apple. She looked at the real one in her hand. "Josie," she said, "go get your uncle." Josie went. She came back with Gideon, who came in from the yard still in his work gloves, and then Eli appeared on the stairs because he had the particular radar of a child who knows when something is happening and wants to be present for it, and Ruth, who happened to be visiting, who would later say she hadn't planned it that way but who might have known, was sitting at the table with her tea. They all stood around the 8 small apples on the counter. "It's not a lot," Eli said. "It's the first year," Marin said. "It'll be more next year." "How many apples does a tree give?" Josie asked. "When it's grown." "Hundreds." Josie took this in with the reverent seriousness of someone beginning to understand that some things take time on purpose. "We'll need more people," she said. Gideon looked at Marin. She looked at him. Something passed between them that was the sum of everything. October and November and January and the custody letter and the home assessment and the fence and the 6 years since, compressed into one look in a kitchen in September. "Yeah," he said, "probably." He took one of the apples off the counter. He bit into it. He chewed. His expression did something complicated. "It's really tart," he said. "It's young," Marin said. "I know." He looked at the apple in his hand. "It's still good." He handed the rest out, one each, standing at the counter in the kitchen of the ranch house that had been one kind of thing and was now another. And they ate the small, tart, imperfect first fruit of a tree they'd planted together when none of them had known how any of it would turn out. Josie said it tasted like candy. Eli said it tasted like regular apples. Ruth said she'd had worse from the store, which from Ruth was genuine praise. Marin didn't say anything about how it tasted. She stood in her kitchen, in her house, with her husband and her children and a grandmother who'd learned to leave doors open rather than lock them. And she held the small apple in her hand and thought about a morning in November, when a man with muddy boots had dropped her equipment in the mud and told her she'd be gone by spring. She thought about what she'd said to him. Then why did I plant an apple tree? She'd said it to stop him, to push back, to hold her ground against a man who'd already decided what she was. But the thing was, and she understood this now in a way she hadn't understood then, she'd said it because it was true. She hadn't known it was true yet. She'd been in the middle of knowing it, the way you're sometimes in the middle of a decision long before you understand you've been making it. She had planted the apple tree because some part of her already knew. Some part of her had looked at that yard, that house, those children, that man standing at a fence with his hat in his hands, and had already decided, here, this, stay. The rest of it, the months, the cold, the custody letter, the fence, the ring, the years, the rest of it had just been the work of catching up to what she'd already known in October when she went to her knees in the mud and helped a little girl bury a dead bird in a wooden box lined with dried grass. You find out who you are in the small moments, not the dramatic ones, not the ones where someone is watching, the ones where nobody is watching and you just do the next right thing anyway. She'd done the next right thing over and over until it became her life. Eli graduated high school on a Thursday in May. 10 years after the winter Marin had left books on a fence post for a boy who couldn't sleep. He was tall now, taller than Gideon by half an inch, which Gideon was still adjusting to, with his father's eyes and his uncle's jaw and the particular quality of attention that had always been his, that close, careful watching of the world that had started as self-protection and become, over time, something closer to understanding. He gave a short speech at graduation. He hadn't told anyone he was giving it until it was already happening. He stood at the podium in the gymnasium of Harlow Creek Regional School and said several things about going somewhere new and carrying what you already know. And then he said this: "Someone once told me that you find out what a place means to you by what you're willing to plant there, not what you say about it, what you plant, because you don't plant things in places you're planning to leave." He didn't look at Marin when he said it, but she felt it anyway. She was sitting between Gideon and Josie, and Gideon took her hand under the folded program in his lap, and she held it, and the gym was full of noise and graduation and families, and she let herself feel all of it, the pride and the years, and the love that had started as something she'd tried hard not to feel, and had become the truest thing she knew. Afterward, in the parking lot, in the May evening, Eli came and found her. He was still in his graduation gown, hat tucked under his arm. He stood in front of her and she could see in his face both the 8-year-old who had said okay in a low voice and allowed himself to be held, and the 18-year-old who was about to leave for a university 2 states away. "The speech," she said. "Yeah," he said. "You could have told me." "I know." He looked at the ground for a second, then up. "I wanted to see your face when you heard it." She laughed, a real one, the kind that came from somewhere unguarded. "That's a little mean, Eli." "A little," he agreed, without remorse. She pulled him in. He let her, the way he had at 8, the same way but different. Bigger now, the arms around her coming from somewhere higher, the hold of someone who understood what he was holding and why. "Thank you," he said into her shoulder. "For the books, for staying, for all of it." She held on for a moment. "Don't thank me," she said. "I'm going to anyway." "I know." She let go. She looked at him, really looked, at this person she'd watched become himself, year by year, book by book, the serious boy who'd learned that it was safe to let things matter. "Go do something worth coming back to tell us about." He nodded. Then, with the smallest version of a smile he'd inherited from nobody in particular and developed entirely on his own. "Yes, ma'am." He went back to find his friends, and Marin stood in the parking lot while May settled around her and Gideon came up beside her and said nothing, just put his arm around her shoulders, and Josie, who was 14 and had opinions about graduation ceremonies being too long, appeared and said she was starving. Could they please go eat? They went to eat. They ate too much and Josie talked the whole time and Gideon burned his mouth on the soup because he didn't wait, which he never did, which he never would, and Ruth video called from Billings because she hadn't been able to make the drive but needed to see Eli's face, and the restaurant was too loud, and all of it was entirely ordinary, and entirely, completely, irreplaceably enough. The wooden apple stayed on the kitchen table through all of it, through the first year and the 5th year and the 10th, through homework at the table and arguments about chores and a dog named Biscuit, who finally went in his sleep at 15, ancient and unbothered, and a new dog after, smaller, faster, named by Josie, after the horse in her 14th favorite drawing. Through winter and spring and the fence that was no longer there, and the tree that grew taller every year until it was tall enough to give shade in the afternoon, which nobody had quite believed it would do when it was a sapling staked against the wind. The apple stayed on the table because nobody moved it, because it was there, and the table needed to have it there. And after a certain number of years, it stopped being a thing anyone consciously noticed and became part of the house the way the creak in the kitchen floorboard was part of the house, the way the 4:30 alarm was part of the house. A house that had been one kind of thing and become another. A house that had started as a man alone in a valley trying to hold something together and become a place where things grew. Not because it was easy, not because the right people appeared at the right moment like something arranged, but because two people made the same unreasonable choice over and over in small moments and cold mornings and difficult conversations and ordinary dinners. The choice to stay. The choice to root. The apple tree bloomed every April. The fruit came in September, more of it every year, better each time. Still a little tart, even now, which was the variety and couldn't be changed, in which all of them had come to prefer. They gave bags of it to neighbors. Ruth took some back to Billings every fall. Josie made something she called pie, but which had a crust that required generous interpretation, and everyone ate it anyway. Every year when the first apples came in, Marin held one in her hand for a moment before she did anything with it. Not long, just a moment, just enough to remember a November morning and a man with mud on his boots who had been so certain about what she was and where she was going. She'd never been certain about anything in those days except the wrong things. She'd been certain she needed to keep moving, certain that staying led to losing, certain that the right response to grief was distance. She'd been wrong about all of it. What she knew now, after years of evidence, was this. Home is not a place you arrive at. It is a thing you build in increments. One cold morning at a time, one conversation, one cup of coffee left the right way on a counter by someone who already knows how you take it. It is built from the willingness to be seen doing something imperfect and to keep doing it anyway, and from the courage to need people when needing people is the scariest possible thing. It takes years. It takes work. It is never finished and it is never perfect. And there will be days when the fence posts are leaning and the roof is leaking and the toast is burned again and someone is sick in the night and you are bone tired in a way that sleep won't fix. And on those days, you do the next thing. You make the coffee. You sit at the table. You pick up the small wooden apple that doesn't quite weigh enough in your hand and you hold it anyway, and you look around at the imperfect, lasting, entirely real life you were brave enough to plant yourself in. And you stay.